This is Play-by-Playcast,
Is that faster than a Greyhound?
the podcast about play-by-play guys, for play-by-play guys, by, I'm told, a play-by-play guy.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Now here's the host of Play-by-Playcast, Tom Bodett. Wait, the Motel 6 guy?
We'll leave the light on for you.
No, Joel Godet.
Joe Godet.
Joel.
Joel?
Joel, with an L.
Okay, here's your host, Joel Godet.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
All right, back at it here on a Friday morning, the 82nd edition of Play-by-Playcast. My name is Joel Godet, and this is the podcast for play-by-play guys, about play-by-play guys, hosted by a play-by-play guy. There is no actual, that's not, I haven't, trademarked that, by the way. I was having a conversation with Mike Cousins, actually, as a matter of fact, friend of the pod, during the week this week, and he said, did I change the name of the podcast? And I was like, what are you talking about? He goes, well, you keep calling it the podcast for play-by-play broadcasters, hosted by a play-by-play broadcaster all day. And I was like, you said it used to be play-by-play guys, and I said I never really thought about it. It just kind of came out that way. So, one way or the other. Play-by-play guys, play-by-play broadcasters, it is the podcast for all of us. Thank you, as always, for clicking subscribe or download or the stream if you are listening online, iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever, YouTube, if you have found the podcast that way. You can always interact with the pod by finding us on Twitter at PxPCast. You can find me at Joel Godet, JoelGodett. Before we get to today's guest, personal news. Not that anybody comes to this podcast to hear about me. You come to hear about the other people. But today's a cool day. If you're listening to this podcast on time, I'm doing television tonight. And that'll be fun because I don't get to say that often. I do a lot of television on the web. When I do Ball State stuff, and it's on ESPN3. It's on Watch ESPN. I mean, if you've got a smart TV, I guess you can watch it on television. But it's not TV. Tonight's going to be fun. Detroit, Wright State, Horizon League men's basketball. If you have nothing else to do on a Friday night, 9 o'clock on ESPNU. It's going to be my first national television game, so I'm a little bit stoked for it, a little bit nervous for it. Hopefully I say some insightful things. There's a good chance I stick my foot in my mouth at some point over the course of 2 hours, so feel free to listen in, watch in, and let me know when that happens, because I'm sure someone on Twitter will. So looking forward to it, super excited. As I record this, it is Thursday night. Not quite sure how much I'm going to sleep until tomorrow, which I need to, because I've got to drive up to Detroit tomorrow. But, hey, looking forward to it. Should be a lot of fun. 9 o'clock Friday night. So 9 o'clock tonight, if you're listening to this on time, on ESPNU. Good way to start out 2018. It's going to be a fun year. It's the first of many first of a couple new ventures, just for me personally, coming up this year. So I'm excited for all of those, in addition to what I'm doing at Ball State, and certainly still love my time and my job and the people that I work with there, and I'm appreciative of what they allow me to do every single day. But that's tonight, so looking forward to that. On to our guest, and it is one of two guests from the Pac-12 network we have on back-to-back weeks here, and Schatz will be with us next week, and Rich Burk is with us this week. He's been with the Pac-12 network for, since its inception. So how long has the Pac-12 network been around? 2012, so whatever the math is on that, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. He's been with the Pac-12 network for 7 years. Or somewhere in that vicinity. Before that, he was the voice of the AAA Portland Beavers, the San Diego Padres affiliate. They came to town. He started doing baseball with the Beavers. They left town. He stayed in Portland. They eventually became the El Paso Chihuahuas, the Padres affiliate in the Pacific Coast League. But had a long run doing some AAA baseball. He now does Hillsboro Hops baseball in the Northwest League, short season A-ball, so still gets to kind of dabble in professional baseball. But the majority of his work is Pac-12 networks, and does a variety of sports. A lot of basketball, a lot of Olympic sports. He does the Olympics, by the way, for NBC. We will talk substantially about that here on the podcast. But Rich is one of those guys that is just diversified in what he does, and does a lot of things very well. So I was curious and interested in having him on the podcast for a lot of those reasons. We will dive into all of that. And I mentioned Mike Cousins earlier. Off the top here, Mike and I were talking, and he said, and I agreed, because I do it all the time, there's nothing worse on a podcast than, like, the intro, because, like, I always skip through the intro. Like, when I listen to Richard Deitch, I skip through the intro. When I listen to Larry Wilmore, oftentimes I skip through the intro. I try to get right to the interview. When I listen to Sam Roberts' wrestling podcast, oftentimes I skip through the intro. I get right to the interview, or depending on how I feel, I just go straight to the state of wrestling. So that being said, we're just going to dive right into Rich Burk. Without further ado, we're going to get straight to the interview. Here from Pac-12 Networks is Rich Burk on the 82nd edition of Play-by-Playcast.
I'm blessed to get to do what I do because a lot of people would like to work for Pac-12 Network. And I found my way in. I had some connections and lucky enough to get the chance to do it. And so right now I do at least 50 events a year for Pac-12 Network I think I've called 10 different sports for them. Not much football. I've done a little bit of football for them. Lots of men's basketball, lots of baseball, lots of volleyball, soccer, swimming, gymnastics, a little bit of softball, a little bit of tennis, some wrestling, and not sure what I'm leaving out there, but that's, and then for NBC, I've done a lot of swimming. I got to call the Olympics for NBC in 2016 for the Rio Games, and most people don't realize, but probably 70% of the announcers that you hear in the Olympics weren't even in Rio. They were at the NBC broadcast facilities in Stamford, Connecticut, calling it off a monitor, and it was a great setup. It really made it easy for the announce teams to pull it off, and so that was a great experience. And I got to call swimming there for their 4K channel, and the 4K was just coming around at the time, and because it was different cameras, they needed different announcers. They couldn't use Dan Hicks and Rowdy Gaines because they might be talking about something different than what the camera was showing. So I got to call the swimming for their 4K channel, along with an Olympic gold medalist named Brendan Hansen. And then I also got to call a men's basketball game against Argentina, USA against Argentina. I got to call the women's gold medal and bronze medal basketball games, and those were all for the 4K channel. And then for regular TV, I got to call race walking and shooting, and that was a blast getting to call them. And then I've done some work for ESPN over the last few years doing the NCAA swim championships, and then last year got to call the SEC championships as well. And that's in a nutshell of what I've done recently.
If I can dissect all of that, we'll go along the path. First off, what's cool about doing the amount of stuff that you do and not being pigeonholed and kind of having the freedom to explore some different things and call some different sports?
Exactly that. I love the process of learning a new sport. And I first did this. I grew up playing baseball and basketball and grew up watching football. So I knew those sports fairly well. And in each case, still learning them. But and I grew up playing soccer as well, so I knew that sport a little bit. But it was the first sort of new sport that I picked up about a decade ago in terms of calling play-by-play for it and really having to learn more about it. And so I went and I've done the same process since then with wrestling and with gymnastics and with volleyball. And I will find a couple of broadcasts from play-by-play announcers that I respect, that people in the industry tell me, okay, these people know what they're talking about. And I'll actually log those two broadcasts. And I'll start at the beginning, and I'll break it down with a fine-tooth comb and open up a Word document, and I will write down things that questions I have, what does this terminology mean? What do they mean when they said this? What's that rule? I don't understand this. Who is that famous player they talked about? And then what happens over the course of the watching the two broadcasts and breaking it down, I'll end up with somewhere between 10 and 20 pages of a single-spaced document. And by the time I'm done with that second broadcast, I go back and I look at the first few pages, and most of my questions from those first few pages have been answered. I've been able to learn enough watching those two broadcasts that I now know, oh, yeah, that's obvious what that rule means. I didn't know it a couple of days ago when I started this process, but I know what it is now. And then only after I've done that am I smart enough to ask intelligent questions. I wouldn't even have known enough about gymnastics to ask a decent question at the beginning. But by the time I've gone through this process of going through these broadcasts with a fine-tooth comb, now I can ask an intelligent question, and then I'll find somebody I know through connections in the industry who's an expert, and I'll meet with them in person if I can, or if not, talk to them over the phone, and then ask them specific questions about their sport. And at that point, I feel like I know enough to be able to go on the air and get us in and out of breaks and be a traffic cop and not embarrass myself, and most importantly, be able to tee up the analyst with good questions about the teams or what's happening in that event or about the sport itself. And then over the course of, if I get the opportunity to do 5 or 10 broadcasts, by the time I've done, say, 10 of them, then I'll know way more than when I started, just through the process of doing the events and sitting next to the analyst and listening to him or her talk about the sport. And so having done, say, 50 or 60 volleyball telecasts now and starting from nothing, I'm not an expert on volleyball by any means, but I'm way better off than when I started, and I know enough to be able to carry on a semi-intelligent volleyball telecast.
How do those conversations go with the experts that you find in terms of, being able to, check your ego in a little bit of a way and be able to ask questions and not worry if somebody's going to look at you kind of 6 ways to Sunday?
Well, they're good about it. Most of the time it's somebody that I know. In the case of gymnastics, I have a niece who was a scholarship gymnast at Southern Utah University.
Well, there you go.
And so that one was easy. For volleyball and wrestling, I went to a Division III school at the time. When I was there, it was NAIA, Pacific University in Forest Grove, Oregon. Yeah. And so they have an excellent wrestling program and a very good volleyball program. And in that case, I talked to the athletic director, whom I'm good friends with, and I'm on their athletic booster club board of directors, and he put me in touch with the wrestling coach and the volleyball coach, and so I just explained to him at the beginning, hey, I've got these telecasts coming up here in a couple of months, and I'm not I by no means an expert on the sport, but I've watched my share of it, which at that time is true, because I've watched these broadcasts and broken them down pretty well. I say, I've watched my share of the sport, but I might ask some questions that aren't very intelligent, and so I sort of inoculate myself at the beginning by saying that, and then they understand. So I think the fact that I do present it to them in that way, and that I have some sort of connection with them to begin with, there's no issue.
How does one call race walking?
by relying a lot on the analyst. My analyst was Chris Maddox, who was a 4-time Olympian, and he knows the sport very well, and he had done the 2012 London Games. He's from Great Britain, and so by relying a lot on him, but it's not a lot different than calling a marathon.
True.
There's just a couple of rules that you need to know about race walking that make it a walk and not a run, and people are DQ'd all the time. And when you hear race walking, why would I want to see people race walk? Well, let me tell you, when the Olympics comes around in Tokyo in 2020, circle the race walking on your calendar because it is intense. These people, there was a Frenchman named Johan Diniz, who has won previous events, who was leading this race, who actually collapsed along. It's a 50-kilometer race, the one I was calling, and he actually collapsed around the 36 or 38-kilometer mark, was passed out right in the middle of the road along the beach there in Rio, and woke up, got back up, and finished the race. And it was to the point where I'm questioning, should they even be allowing him to do this?
Yeah, that's fair.
But he did. It was intense. So you call in a sport where you don't really know it, you call it by just staying general and saying who's in the lead. And here's the key. I knew probably the 20 people who were going to be in the lead or in that front chasing pack. And I did a note card on each of them. And I had a statistician next to me whose sole job was to put the note cards in front of me of the 6 or 8 people who were in the lead or in that chase pack. And if somebody dropped back, that card came out, and the card of somebody else came in if they joined them. And so I had those 6 or 8 people right in front of me all the time. And then I also had those same cards in a Word document alphabetically in my hands. So if for some reason somebody was getting lapped and I needed to know something about somebody who was in 38th place, I could go, and I had them set up alphabetically, and I had them set up numerically in 2 different files, numerically by their bib number. And so it would just take me a moment to be able to reference somebody who wasn't in those chasing packs, as the Americans weren't, because Americans aren't very good at race walking. At least, they weren't in 2016. And so through the cards in front of me, through the leaders, and through the 2 files I had that had all the cards in them, one set up by bib number and one set up alphabetically, I was able to refer to whoever I needed to. And then it's my job just to sort of give background information on them. It's the analyst's job to analyze their form and maybe say some things that he knew about their past that I wouldn't have been able to dig up through my research. And don't try to get too technical. Don't try to explain too much about their form, but know enough just to tee up the analyst, can ask questions, and that's how you call it. And it was intense. I think a 20K women's race I did came down to the very end, and it was really fun to call.
To do race walking and shooting and all those kind of niche sports in the Olympics, I know NBC is really big on storytelling, particularly around the Olympics, and being able to relay, like you were just talking about, more so the stories of who these people are, and to get you to get people to care about, race walking or luge or skeleton, whatever the sport that you normally wouldn't watch is. What's it like? What's different about calling the Olympics and calling those sports than it would be about something that's more mainstream? And do you enjoy the aspect of being able to be almost more of a storyteller that way?
I enjoy it very much. And my biggest background is in baseball. I've called more than 2,000 baseball games. And as you know, Joel, calling baseball, you're presented with that opportunity to get into stories about the athletes more so than other sports because there's dead time, and people who don't get baseball, people who think baseball is boring, don't understand that aspect. Well, first of all, they don't understand the intense pitcher-hitter battle and what each is trying to do. And I think if you understand that, you don't think baseball is boring. But beyond that, even if you don't understand that, you like baseball because of the rhythm, because of the opportunity to listen to those stories, and from my standpoint, to tell those stories. So I have a natural bent toward that anyway. I'm not saying I'm good or bad at it. I have a natural bent toward liking it. And so when I go to the Olympics and recognize that people, other than the very small core audience that follows shooting, they don't care about it, but they want to know that the American woman who's in the semifinals and her husband plays football for the Denver Broncos, they want to know that story. They want to know how difficult it was for her to get through the troubles that she had to even get to the Olympics. They want to know those kind of stories. And to me, and I remember people being critical of NBC about not being true to the sports, and it's all about the stories. Well, I'm sorry, that is what it's about. That's why people watch. They want to know the stories of the athletes.
When did you start doing the work for Pac-12 Network in particular?
Their first year.
So
and I didn't get many events the first year. I had done lots of basketball and football play-by-play for FSN Northwest, which became Root Sports. And then the Pac-12 started its own network, and everybody thought I'd be one of the Northwest guys. And I was having difficulty getting much traction there. And I got one men's basketball game, the opening night of their very first year in 2012, 2013. And then didn't hear much from them. And then they got desperate and needed somebody to call wrestling. And I called their wrestling championships in 2013. And never heard from them one way or the other after that, as far as, whether or not they liked it. And then in the summer of 2013, after their first year, they offered me 4 volleyball matches. I said, sure, I'd be happy to do them. And about 2 weeks later, they offered me 14 more events.
There you go.
And so at this point, that was my feedback, that they started offering me these events. And then the second year, I got about 30 events. And the third year, I got, I think, 55. And I've been doing about that number ever since. So it was just an analyst, a basketball analyst that I had worked with a lot. He had an agent. The analyst is Lamar Hurd, and
with the Blazers,
with the Blazers, yes. And Lamar and I had worked 30 or 40 games together, and on FSN Northwest and Root Sports, and was a good friend of mine, and he was looking for representation and found an agent back east. And the agent was watching his tape and said, hey, who's the play-by-play guy? And Lamar mentioned my name, and he said, well, find out if he has an agent. And so I ended up getting in contact with this guy, and he had some ins at Pac-12 Network, and that's how I got in. And without Lamar, I'm not doing this right now. I owe a lot to him.
Well, you answered the question I had a little bit there as well. But that all being said, what was it like to do even the few games you did at the beginning and be part of a new network and to kind of be doing something for the first time and experience something that itself was kind of in its infancy?
It was great. And what I really appreciated about it from the very beginning, the two coordinating producers with Pac-12 Network, Kyle Reichling, who handles football, men's and women's basketball, baseball, and softball, and Will O'Toole, who handles all the other sports, what they classify as the Olympic sports. They made it clear from the beginning there will be no yelling and screaming in the truck. And I've worked with yellers and screamers before, and people who are, and I don't mind the intensity of it, but people with Pac-12 Network, the producers, the directors, are so laid back, and yet they care very much about what they do. But they're also chill about it. It really makes it fun. And I noticed that from the beginning without knowing anything about Kyle or Will, and without knowing that they had said from the very beginning that this is the way it's going to be. And I noticed that. I started asking around, and they said, oh, yeah, that's by design. And so that made it really fun from the outset. And I've also had the opportunity, and it's a weird quirk of mine that I even know this, I've had the opportunity over the last 5 seasons to work with 62 different analysts on Pac-12 Network alone. And part of that is a function of calling 10 different sports, and part of it may be a function that, once an analyst works with me, they don't want to work with me again. I don't know. But I've worked with 62 different analysts, and it's really been fun getting to know these people and work with them, and I've developed a lot of good friendships out of it.
When did you did you sit down one day and mark them all out? How did you figure out it was 62?
I realized from the beginning when I started freelancing that I needed to keep track of things for financial purposes, keep track of who I'd invoiced and who I hadn't, or what expense reports I filled out, what events I had coming up. So I created an Excel spreadsheet that had the date of the event, the day of the week, who it was, where it was, the time of the event, the show code. If you're going to send out an invoice for either the event itself or for the expenses, you got to have the show code. That's on there. I have whether or not I filled out my travel form. I have whether or not I'm staying in a hotel. I've got the amount I'm supposed to be paid. I've got the amount that I have been paid. I've got the amount that I'm supposed to pay my agent. I've got the amount that I'm supposed to expense, whether or not I've filled out that form, whether or not I've been paid for that. And then I just, for whatever reason, I don't know why, I also started writing down the name of the producer, director, the analyst, and whatever sideline reporter there might be. And after about 2 years, I was looking at it thinking, man, there are a lot of names on this list. So then I just started keeping track, and now 5 years in, I'm up to 62 on Pac-12 network alone. That doesn't even count the other networks.
I've just decided I no longer want to freelance after hearing all of that.
It's rewarding. I really like it, and it was hard at the beginning, but it's like anything else. Once you get into it, you get into kind of a rhythm, and so now it's no problem keeping track of it.
Well, let me go back to before all of that started for you as well. And you had mentioned baseball being the sport you've probably done the most of in your career. If I can start at the end of your baseball career and we'll work backward, what was it like when, by no fault of your own, all of a sudden you're no longer a AAA baseball broadcaster when the Portland Beavers leave town?
I'm assuming we're not going to have too many staunch Portland Beavers fans listening to this broadcast, but it was great. It was great. And I'll tell you why. And I loved it. I loved every second of doing AAA baseball when I was there at the event. But it's hard being away. It was hard being away from my family.
Yeah. And that's
I
a
did
tough
10
league.
years of AAA baseball. Yes. The Pacific Coast League has the toughest travel of any sports league in the world. This is not a complaint. It's because, as I've often said, I wasn't traipsing through the desert and nobody was shooting at me. And I was getting to sit down and call a baseball game every day. But it's 144 games in 152 days. And you're waking up because, according to minor league baseball's rules or the Pacific Coast League's rules, I don't know which, if a team doesn't take the first flight out in the morning, if they don't have the first flight scheduled in the morning, which is generally at 5:45 or 6 a.m., and you miss your flight and you miss a game that night, you have to pay, I think at the time it was $50,000.
Oh, boy.
So to cover their own tails, they always schedule that first flight. If you don't schedule the first flight and you miss it, then you got to pay that fine. If you schedule the first flight and travel delays means you don't get there that night, well, then you're off the hook. So you're always flying at 6 in the morning. You're always flying coach. And then if you're flying back east, you don't even go to the hotel. You get there and you go to the ballpark that day. And for whatever reason, it seemed almost inevitable that the second day in was a day game. And so you're not even really getting any rest until the night of your second day in the city. And then after a couple of more games, you pick up stakes and you move on. Again, not a complaint, just a statement of fact. And then it's one thing to be away from your family for 6 months a year when you're making big league money. It's another thing to be away from them that long when you're making AAA money. And even when I'm at home, even when I was at home, it was like I was on the road because the kids would get up in the morning and go to school, and I'd still be asleep. And then by the time they get home from school at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm already at the ballpark that night. So it was the rare day game when I would even get to see my family much at all. And so with my son at the time was 7 years old when the Portland Beavers played their last home game in 2010. And Joel, that last broadcast, after doing 10 years of AAA baseball, knowing that there would be no more on the post-game show, it's almost embarrassing now, but I wasn't embarrassed by it at the time. I sobbed on the air for like 45 minutes, just going through the history of the last 10 years. We had this whole hour-long retrospective that we did after that last broadcast, talking about the last 10 years and playing highlights from those games. And the final goodbyes were hard. And interesting story, my broadcast partner at the time, Tim Haggerty, who still does El Paso Chihuahuas play-by-play, and by the way, would be an excellent interview for you on these podcasts. Really thoughtful guy about the art of play-by-play itself. Excellent broadcaster. Tim Haggerty was there with me.
Did he ever leave, by the way, or did he go straight? He went with the team to Tucson and then to El Paso, right?
Went with the team to Tucson and El Paso,
okay.
Yes. But after the whole game was over, this is just a tangent here for you, and all the fans have left, and I'm up there cleaning up the radio equipment, and my son, who was 7 years old at the time, had worn, it was his first year playing baseball, and had worn his T-ball uniform to the game, and was down on the field running around on the bases, and Tim elbows me as we're cleaning up the equipment, and he's looking down at the field, and he says, "Do you realize that this is the final baseball game that will ever be played in this stadium? Your son is the last person ever to wear a baseball uniform on the field in this stadium." And I thought, wow, that's something. But anyway, what led me off of that tangent is that was my son's first year playing baseball. Not only did I not get to coach his team, but I didn't even get to go to any games. I think I saw him play once. And so I knew the time was coming that I was going to have to back off doing AAA baseball. Probably would have done one more season full time, and then I would have done what Dean Ellis had done in Des Moines and do home games only. But the fact that it left, and the fact that I was getting a lot of freelance TV gigs at that point, I didn't need AAA baseball anymore. So while I missed it, at the same time, it was an excellent thing for my family. And then I got to coach my son's baseball team for 7 seasons after that, and including a couple of fall baseball seasons. And it was great. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I loved those AAA years, but I really loved when I wasn't doing that anymore. That's
interesting, and it's interesting you brought up when the TV work started to kind of flow in for you, because my first reaction when I thought about talking to you for this, I was like, I wonder, like, the incredible fear I would have had, and maybe that's just like life experience and where you were at personally and professionally at that time. Like my thought would have been this like undying fear of, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? How am I going to put food on the table? So it was interesting to hear the kind of different perspective of how that all fell out for you.
Yes, well, I told you I'm blessed, and I'm blessed in a way that I haven't mentioned, in that I have a wife who, number one, likes baseball, likes sports, and has been really patient with his career. But there were years and years there, Joel, where I wasn't making much money, and not only was she understanding, but she was gainfully employed in working for a great company. And it was because of that. That's a big reason why I was able to continue doing what I was doing and kind of fighting my way through it until a time when, and frankly, TV pays way better than radio does. Way better than radio does. And without her patience with me and without her income, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So when I talk to young broadcasters, and I've been married for 28 years, and it's the best thing in my life. But when I talk to young broadcasters, I say, if you want to stay in this business, you got to and work your way up. You got to do one of 3 things. First of all, you got to be very lucky and get a big break at the beginning and make it big early on, which is unlikely to happen, which leaves the other 2 possibilities. Number 1, stay single. And then the other one is, if you're going to get married, have somebody who's really, really understanding and who's in it with you for the long haul. Yeah. That's the only way it's going to work. Otherwise, what's going to happen is, the marriage is going to come to an end, which is far worse than the other option, which is your broadcasting career is going to come to an end. You're going to have to do something where you make some money.
Yeah. It's interesting because in all of that pursuit, you did still make it to the major league level in your time in baseball as well. And I did want to ask you about getting that opportunity. What was it like for you, and what do you remember still to this day? Because I think your first major league game was in San Juan, if I've got that right, doing a major league game for the Expos.
I had done a couple of spring training games for the Padres in 2003, and working alongside Jerry Coleman. Jerry Coleman with the Padres, legendary broadcaster, more known for his foibles than for put a star on that one. Jerry was a master of the malapropism. Winfield goes back, hits his head against the wall. It's rolling back toward the infield, that kind of thing. Rich Folkers is throwing up in the bullpen. That's the kind of thing that Jerry Coleman is well known for across the nation. In San Diego, they know him for being the guy that came into their homes and their cars for decades, and who was passionate about his Padres and who was excellent at the big moments. And he treated me like I was a king. Here I was this guy from AAA coming up to do 2 spring training radio broadcasts, and he acted like he'd known me forever and was extremely complimentary off the air and on the air. I could not have been treated nice. That's my takeaway from those games. Another takeaway I have from those games is that sometimes serendipity is with you. And the first batter I ever called at the major league level, interleague play at Peoria Sports Complex. It was Padres against I think it was the White Sox in 2003. And the first batter for the White Sox was a guy named, I want to say it was Josh Schroeder. And there was a late lineup change, and he was a guy that they had just brought over from the minor league complex. And I happened to notice maybe 5 minutes before we went on the air, and there was no information on him. Wasn't even on the roster. So I ran over to the White Sox broadcasters. I can't remember who they were. And I said, "Who is this guy?" And they said, "Oh," and they did a little digging and said, "Okay, that's Josh Schroeder." Otherwise, the first batter I ever called at the major league level, I wouldn't even have known who he was. So serendipity was with me that day. But then the next year, I got to call games for the Expos in Puerto Rico, and Elliot Price was the play-by-play announcer, and they needed somebody else to come in and work with him. And so I was fortunate to get the chance to do that. And a lot of credit goes to Brett Dolan, who would be another great guy for you to interview. He's the voice of the Arkansas Razorbacks now, and he did 8 or 10 years with the Houston Astros, and he had been doing games for the Expos, and he's the one who told me, yeah, you know what, they because the Expos had been bringing lots of people in throughout the season to Montreal for 2003 and 2004 seasons to work with Elliott, and they needed somebody in Puerto Rico, and he told me a couple of months ahead of time. And so this is and Brett was at the time doing play-by-play for the Tucson Sidewinders, and it was the first day of a series when Tucson was in Portland. And so I fired off an email to Montreal, and by the end of that 4-game series, I had that gig, and wouldn't have gotten it without Brett Dolan. So I went down there and I called 10 games, and interesting thing I found out about that was that, and I don't know why, major league clubhouses were way more laid back than AAA clubhouses.
That's interesting.
I don't know what it is, but guys up there are much looser, and it may be that odd petri dish of a AAA clubhouse where you've got the veteran guys who aren't happy to be in AAA, and the up-and-coming guys who spend a little time in big league spring training and think they should be in the big leagues. And then you've got the organizational guys who are sort of roster fillers who never thought they'd even get as far as AAA, and they happen to be there. And so it's an odd mix, but I found major league clubhouses with the 4 teams I dealt with, the Expos and the Braves and the Pirates and the Blue Jays, to be much more laid back. Interviewed the late Roy Halladay when I was there, and we sat in the clubhouse, and I would never do a AAA interview in the clubhouse because I did a few of them where we were bothered by other players and antics and such. And when I was in the big leagues, I said, ask Halladay for an interview. And he said, yeah, let's do it right here. So we sat down on a couple of stools, and nobody bothered us. And he was as good a guy as could be. And, so those are my takeaways from that experience. And getting to call games in another country. 4th of July of 2004, I called a game in Puerto Rico between two Canadian teams.
That's that can't be something that happens too often. That's a trivia question answer right there for you.
Yeah.
The start of your baseball career, though, I found fascinating as well, because that's something that I feel like would not maybe we're getting back, kind of coming back around to the point in time where it would happen again. But selling concessions and doing the radio simultaneously. Can you tell me your first year with the Bend Bucks, what that was like and how you made that work? And if anything ever went horribly wrong for you, where is humorous looking back on it?
I was part of a 5-person staff. There was the owner, his wife, the general manager, who was Bob Hards, who later went on to do play-by-play in Midland, Texas for the Texas League team there, and might still be doing it as far as I know. And he was the GM. And then the owner and his wife, their son, was sort of an assistant. And then I was the administrative assistant. And I was right out of college. And I got to do 2 innings of play-by-play at the home games. And, Joel, it was the worst play-by-play you've ever heard in your life. And it was frustrating because I knew what I wanted to say. I'd been listening to baseball all my life and had never really tried it much. Unlike most people in this industry, I didn't grow up turning the sound down on the TV and practicing play-by-play. The thought never crossed my mind that I was going to be doing play-by-play.
Yeah,
I thought
I'm in that boat too. So
okay, I thought I'd be playing. And even
I was not in that boat. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I played NAIA baseball, and anybody else, looking back on it, anybody else would have said, there's no way, you have no chance. But I thought I did. It was my junior college baseball coach who put the light on my head that said, you should go up to Pacific University. I was playing junior college baseball in Southern California, and he said, he had some ties up here. Go up to Pacific University, and you can play baseball, and you can be the voice of the boxers for football. And as it turned out, that's exactly the way it worked out. It's like a light bulb went on above my head. Oh, sportscasting, not a bad idea. And then it was my baseball coach at Pacific, a guy named Chuck Buffaro, who put me in contact with the team in Bend. And right out of college, I got to do their play-by-play. And I'd done some of it in college, but almost no baseball. And so I knew what I wanted to say, but it wasn't coming out right, and I was so frustrated. But the experience of that summer was amazing. So my job was to do play-by-play of the 4th and 5th innings at the home games. But during the first 3 innings, I had to service the concession stands, bring them ice, bring them hot dogs out of the freezer. I would have to drive across town. To get ice on the big nights when we were running low. And during this time, I had my little Walkman radio with the Steve Bartman-esque over the years headset. And I would keep track of Bob Hart's play-by-play while I was doing. Anytime something would happen, I would stop, set the ice buckets down, one in each hand, get out my little tiny scorebook in the little Meade memo pad that I had made for myself that had only 5 innings in the scorebook because that's all I needed, the first 3 innings plus the 2 innings that I called. And I'd write down the play. I'd stick it back in my pocket, pick up the buckets of ice, continue my walk to the concession stand, dump them in, and then write down the next play. And then when it was time for in the bottom of the 3rd inning, I'd go up and sit down when there were 2 outs, and then the 4th inning would come, and I'd call the 2 innings of play-by-play. And then basically I could forget I didn't have to keep track of the rest of the game because I had other duties to do. And I didn't have to write them down in the scorebook because I was done with play-by-play for that day. And that was it. That was my summer and 2 innings of play-by-play at the home games. And Bob got laryngitis one day, and I got to call an entire game. and it was the most ragged thing you've ever heard, but I got through it. And then over the next, I was getting married the next off season. And over the next 5 years, I worked for a sporting event management company, Peter Jacobson Productions, because I didn't want to have to move around like a play-by-play announcer normally has to do to stay in the industry. And I didn't want to do that at the outset of my marriage. So I worked for a sporting event management company, a professional golfer. We managed golf tournaments in the Portland area. And during that time, I did play-by-play for the University of Portland's baseball team on the radio, and got a lot better. And then went back to Bend 6 years later, this time as the number one guy, did 1 year there, and then that team moved to Portland as a short season A-ball team, and I was there for 6 years, and then AAA baseball came, and I got to work my way up the ladder without ever having to move.
Which is an interesting and unique way that the career kind of gets built for you as well, and I guess it's a show of faith. I don't know, faith in yourself that, hey, like, it's possible to stick in one place and do the right things, and good things open the right doors for you, I guess, if that makes sense. As much as we all get worried about where that next job is going to take us, sometimes you let it play out and you do your own thing, and you wind up in the right place eventually, don't you?
Right. Yes. It's about being patient. Last night I did an Oregon State basketball game, and Oregon State center was Drew Eubanks, and they have been talking to him about not trying to do too much. You know, stay underneath, let the ball find you. And it's funny when he does that. How often the ball finds him, and there he is for a pretty easy bucket. It's the same thing in life. You know, sometimes if you're just patient, things find you, and I've been fortunate enough to where that's happened for me. And we went to school in the Portland area. I told you at an NAIA school. Now it's Division III, Pacific University. And my wife started working over here at the time we got married, and I was working with the sporting event management company. And then the summer of '94, I was back 4 hours away in Bend doing play-by-play for them, this time as the number one guy. Well, the AAA Portland Beavers had moved to Salt Lake City, and so there was no baseball here. And the team in Bend got the right to move their team there. And October of '94, I moved to Portland as the new Portland Rockies play-by-play announcer, and we bought a house. And here it is, all these years later, and we still live in the same house, and I've never moved.
Well, Rich, if people want to watch you or get a hold of you on social media, one of those things, how do they go about finding you?
Well, on social media, it's at Rich Burk 1, the numeral 1. There's no E in Burk. And they can email me at rich@richburk.com. And I have my own website, richburk.com. I haven't updated it too much recently. I need to redo it. But
you can get the Rich Burk baseball scorebook there too.
Yes, you can. I have my own line of baseball scorebooks, which has been great. And
you're the Bob Carpenter competitor.
Yes, I am. There's he's more well known. More people use his, but I have a segment of the population out there that swears by mine, and so I don't mind being number 2 to Bob at all.
How did you? By the way, before I let you go, how did you come to decide to sell it? Decide like, hey, this could catch on. What about yours works for you? Because I do my own too. I've always been one that has my own unique quirks. But can you kind of give me the story on why you do what you do on that front, and what gave you the idea to turn it into a little side business?
I had used other scorebooks, and they didn't suit me because they were too structured. My scorebooks are more open, and you can rather than having to put certain things in certain spots, you can sort of put what you want where. But also, I wanted a way to keep track of pitches, more so than one of the scorebooks out there has like 5 boxes, 3 for balls and 2 for strikes, and that wasn't enough for me. So I wanted my own way to keep track of pitches, and so just came up with my own without ever any thought of of selling it to anybody. And I'm pretty good with graphic design. That's one of the things I did for the sporting event management company was I was their graphic designer. And so I designed my own layout and began using it, and I had a couple of people tell me, hey, this is good. Can I borrow that? And I said, sure. And I'd print them off a sheet, and they'd go make their own copies. And then somebody said one time, you should publish that. And I said, well, I wouldn't know how to get started. And then a friend of mine was working for a self-publishing company in the mid-2000s, Lulu.com, which is now the publisher of my scorebooks. And he was telling me about this. He was one of their West Coast sales representatives, and I thought, wow. And it was the biggest thing about it is that there's no money up front. All you got to do is make a PDF file of your book and upload it. And if somebody buys it, be it a baseball scorebook or a novel or a calendar or whatever, somebody buy it. Lulu takes a cut, you get a cut. There's no money up front.
Oh wow!
And they print them one at a time. Somebody buys it, it doesn't get printed until somebody buys it.
Interesting.
And yeah, check it out, Lulu.com. If you have any ideas for any kind of novel or a nonfiction book or anything, go there, and it's a really, really good service. And so in February of 2007, I uploaded these various scorebooks, some for broadcasters, some for just fans. And other than a little bit of marketing, I had some advertising at a place that most of your listeners know, STAA.com,
sure, with
John Chalesnik, and that was good. And then finally decided that, you know what, I didn't want to make that investment in it anymore. People just, I'm hopeful that people find it through word of mouth, but the advertising there was great. That helped it a little bit. But other than a little bit of marketing and occasionally sending out a tweet about it, I've hardly done any work since 2007 on it, because they're just up there and people buy them, and every quarter they send me a check. And I've sold, I don't know, maybe 1,000, maybe 1,200 of them over the years, and without hardly doing any work. It's like I'm getting free money. You know what it does? It pays for my web hosting.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right, that's Rich Burk joining us here on Play-by-Playcast. Don't you just want to go call race walking right now? Like, if you don't listen to this podcast and go, gosh, I want to try calling race walking, like, we're in the wrong field here, folks. Like, one of my, and I've said this many times on the podcast, one of my goals in broadcasting and in life is to broadcast an Olympic Games. And it just, like, sitting there listening to Rich talk about, like, clay shooting and race walking and what goes into broadcasting that stuff just fascinated me. So hopefully you guys took out of that what I did as well. If you want to check out Rich Burk's website, by the way, he talked at the end about his scorebook. You can find Rich Burk's website, and he sells the scorebooks there at richburk.com. That's RICHBURK, richburk.com. And then he mentioned self-publishing as well, which is cool. I didn't know about this. Lulu.com, LULU.com, where I would presume you can also find Rich Burk's scorebook. But, I mean, if you've got stuff you want to publish yourself, like essays on world domination, knock yourself out. Lulu.com. Really cool resource that I'm glad Rich brought up here on the podcast. Anyway, that'll do it for us here on this edition of Play-by-Playcast. Until next week, when Ann Schatz will stop by, which will be a really cool conversation. First of all, second female broadcaster we've had on the podcast, and we dive into some of the trailblazing nature of her career, because she was the first female sports anchor in 2 different markets ever. So Ann will talk a little bit about that. She'll talk about Tanya Harding and going to Lillehammer for the Olympics without a credential, and still getting an interview and becoming like a sensation while she was there because of it. And much more with Ann Schatz next week here on PxPCast. But for now, we are out of time. Marshmallow is playing, and I've got to go drive to Detroit. So 9 o'clock, ESPNU, if you have nothing else to do on a Friday. Look forward to seeing you. And right back here again next week as well on Play-by-Playcast.